This is China and the World, hosted by Asia Society Switzerland.
Hello, and welcome to the fourth episode of China and the World, where we are looking at the evolving role of China in different regions and countries. I'm your host, Nico Luchsinger. With this episode, we arrive at China's largest neighbor, India. While India is expected to overtake China by population within the next few years, it is still lagging behind in terms of economic development. The relationship between the two countries is very complicated. It's one of competition, at times even open conflict, but also increasingly of cooperation. So today we will be talking about the border clash in the Himalayas in June 2020 and the skirmishes that led up to the hottest conflict between the two giants in over 50 years, how the two countries differ fundamentally in their visions for Asia's future, and where the opportunities for both of them lie with each other and where the relationship might be heading. To some observers, it is a surprise that China and India, the two Asian superpowers, do not clash more often with each other. Yet to others, it's also completely unreasonable for the two to not collaborate more closely. One thing seems clear. Right now, China and India are not on the best of terms, despite a slight easing of tensions over the last few years. Here's Tanvi Madan of the Brookings Institution.
When Indian and Chinese leaders say that India and China are more connected today than they've ever been, or more engaged today than they've ever been before, now the bar is very low, but that's actually true. Whether it's in terms of leader-level engagement, official engagement, civil society engagement, but also people-to-people engagement, it's still nothing compared to, say, India's ties with the US or other countries in Europe. But it is more than it's ever been in the past. There are more Indian students studying in China now than they are in Russia, which used to be a traditional place that, for example, a lot of medical students went. You're seeing more engagement, but there isn't a daily direct flight between Delhi and Beijing to this day.
When Chinese and Indian military clashed in the Galwan Valley in June 2020, that was the hottest encounter in the ongoing Sino-Indian border dispute that has lingered on since the war between the two countries back in 1962. The clash resulted in casualties on both sides, but has also had an effect on direct trade and investment relations, as well as on India's involvement in the region. Here's Shashi Tharoor, who is a member of the Indian Parliament, a former diplomat and author.
I do think the Chinese never intended things to get so far out of hand that 20 Indian soldiers were killed, and thereby India really got its back up. I think the Chinese thought they'd have a deployment, park some people somewhere, there'd be some talks, the talks would drag on, the Chinese would never leave, the de facto reality on the ground would be different and they'd carry on, because their objective appears to be to extend China's troop presence to the intersection of the Galwan River and the Shyok River in Ladakh, which would essentially take the Galwan Valley off, make it off bounds to India. And that seems to be the military objective of this particular exercise. I think it went farther than the Chinese had intended. And the result was, of course, this very unpleasant standoff where India is not prepared to back down. India has in turn taken some heights which it didn't occupy before the Chinese intrusion, just to show the Chinese, if you play this game, we can play it too. So if you back down and go back to the positions before April, so will we. The talks are still dragging on, and the Chinese are showing no sign of budging. Now, the longer-term prospects for India-China relations are therefore not good, because I would say that India is not going to be able, with a rather agitated public, is not going to be able to pacify the public into accepting a new status quo without some sort of gesture of withdrawal from the Chinese that the Chinese have so far not been able to give, or not felt able to give. And in these circumstances, frustrations are mounting. India has been doing some fairly petty retaliation by banning a whole bunch of about 100 Chinese mobile apps, which arguably don't mean as much to the Chinese companies deploying them as to the Indian consumers who will no longer be able to use them. But the fact is that is symbolic, and I think certainly Indian construction projects are likely to be denied to Chinese companies, that trade opportunities in India, investment opportunities in India are bound to go down. Some of it will hurt India too. So it's really not a good situation for the two countries to be in. And it's going to take, I think, a great deal of imagination to reverse course. Again, the pull-out of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership was partially because of concerns of Chinese dominance of that arrangement, and it's been portrayed domestically as shielding vulnerable Indians from the depredations of Chinese economic predators. So it's going to be rather difficult, I think, for us to very easily get back to a normal relationship.
So just in case you missed that, Shashi was referring there to India pulling out of RCEP, that's the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, a free trade agreement between Southeast Asian countries as well as Japan, South Korea, China, and others. The agreement was signed late last year, but India had already decided a bit earlier not to join. So how did the normal relationship that Shashi was referring to look like? And what can an earlier border incident in 2017, the so-called Doklam standoff, tell us about the very different visions that China and India have, both for their relationship as well as for the region as a whole? In April of 2020, 2 months before the military encounter in June, I had the chance to talk with Tanvi Madan, who you have already heard of earlier, and who had the India project at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and with Samir Saran, president of the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi, one of Asia's most influential think tanks. First, I asked Tanvi how India sees its relationship with China.
For the India-China relationship from India's perspective, there are kind of, like for a lot of countries, elements of cooperation and competition. But in the Indian case, there are also elements of potentially conflict. India has a stable relationship with China right now. It engages with it on a number of subjects, including the economic relationship has been growing. But this is largely a competitive relationship for India. If you ask Indian policymakers privately what their kind of major external strategic challenge is in the years ahead, they'd likely admit that it is rising China's behavior, alone and in conjunction with India's other rival, Pakistan. So the way I've described it is that India essentially is managing its China relationship through a process of competitive engagement with kind of an Indian flavor to it, which is a mix of competition and engagement, essentially engaging to try to benefit from the Chinese relationship as much as possible, to keep it on a low boil, but also making sure that it's prepared to compete with China for both China's growing presence in its region, to ensure that it can deter bad Chinese behavior, as well as prepare for a longer-term challenge in case that behavior turns to the negative.
Let's maybe flip this around very quickly. Samir, you're obviously in New Delhi, not in Beijing, but can you tell us how India is seen from China?
I think in the last few years, India has certainly become a more important dynamic in China's calculus. And I would say the last few years, it would probably be post-Doklam. I think in the period between the end of Pax Americana, which is 2007-8 during the financial crisis, to the middle of this decade, the Chinese had begun to take India for granted. I think they had more folks and more researchers in Beijing studying some East African countries than they did India. They had more deployment to cultivate relationships in Central Asia than they did vis-a-vis India. But somewhere around 2015-16, I think the Chinese have begun to take us more seriously. And certainly post-Doklam, it has a certain strategic element as well. Do they take us seriously enough? Perhaps not. Do they pay as much attention to us as we do to them? Certainly no. And is that going to change anytime soon? Certainly not. I think we are still a decade away. We are still India becoming $6 to $7 trillion in size in terms of GDP before we start figuring into serious Chinese calculus, when their Politburo sits and talks about us for half an hour. The Chinese view of India is still a country which is besieged with development challenges, crazy politics, inefficient democracy, and this crazy ability to get along with the Americans and Europeans.
Let's bring up the incident that you have already mentioned, Doklam, which I think in many ways can be seen from today's vantage point as a little bit of a turning point in the relation. Tanvi, could you, in all briefness, I know it's a complicated story, remind us how that standoff started and also why it ended the way it ended?
So Doklam was actually about a land, that territory that both not India and China claim, but Bhutan and China claim. It took place at the tri-junction of where Bhutan, China, and India meet. India and Bhutan have a very close security relationship. It is the closest you can perhaps think of India as having an alliance, because India has certain defense and security obligations for Bhutan. What we saw there is something we've seen in the India-China relationship before. We saw it in the spring of 2013 and the fall of 2014, which is Chinese troops taking actions to change the status quo at what is largely an undemarcated border, at least in some elements of it. And what you saw on the part of India was taking a blocking move to essentially stop China from taking that action at the boundary, and then letting politicians and diplomats resolve the question directly themselves, while India putting troops forward at the border and continuing to hold its ground, and as many people saw it, showing resolve. The reason this was striking is not just because what was different about this is it involved India's obligations to Bhutan, so it was not just a China-India incident, but also how long it took to resolve. This took over 2 months to resolve, and if you compare that to the 2013 and 2014 incidents, which were resolved much more quickly, it told you how both some of the mechanisms that had been set up to deal with these kind of incidents were not working. But second, also the broader strategic relationship, there were concerns and a lack of trust that is required for these kind of issues to be resolved. And that was taking, obviously, a different dimension.
I think the Doklam standoff is less about the boundary dispute. And it's more about the fundamental disagreements between both nations about the future of Asia and certainly of that region. The BRI, as we study it in India, is seen as China's super sovereign project that is supposed to, in many ways, bring into its fold neighbors and those far away to respond to the Chinese political, economic, and governance stimuli. India stayed away from it. The Chinese are making the boldest effort since Genghis Khan, perhaps even bigger than Genghis Khan, in creating this huge connectivity project. They want the $20 trillion markets of EU. They are not going to allow a South Asian neighbor to prevent that large project. So for the Chinese, the sub-regions are not important. So India feels miffed that they don't recognize SAARC. China doesn't give a damn about the SAARC. They will cultivate India's neighbors if it suits the larger Chinese project, and they've been doing that quite aggressively. India obviously is responding to that.
But it seems to me that the relationship over the last few years has been getting closer again, or at least that both countries have tried their best to make it this way. There have been several summits, one actually in Wuhan between Prime Minister Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping. So, Tanvi, could you talk a little bit about sort of the development of the relationship post-Doklam? Are the two countries actually getting closer, or does it just look this way?
This was a resetting of tone and temperature in the relationship. But over the last 2.5 years, since that process began, we haven't seen any resolution of the fundamental differences or any easing of them between the two countries that you would normally see if countries were really serious about kind of getting over some strategic hurdles. And I think some of that is because of the broader things that Samir laid out, which is both countries have overlapping peripheries that each one has a vision of that in many ways is contradictory. The way Indian policymakers will often put it is that they want to see both a multipolar world and a multipolar Asia, whereas they think China wants to see perhaps a multipolar, bipolar world, but a unipolar Asia. Those things are in fundamental contradiction, along with a kind of a number of other issues that have come up at the bilateral, regional, and even global level. And those differences have not been resolved in these last 2.5 years. What you have seen is the two governments have used this phrase, and particularly the Indian government, trying to get to a stable equilibrium where they don't let differences become disputes, which is often forgotten is it was supposed to be to use this time to look for new opportunities. There we've actually seen less happen. There has been some, but none of the problems have gone away. So the boundary dispute remains. The concerns about China's relationship with Pakistan and India have not just remained, but in the last 6 months or so, that's again become a very kind of in-your-face problem for India as China has backed Pakistan on the subject of Kashmir in particular. And they've gone out of their way to do so in a manner that we had not seen traditionally. You have seen some kind of attempts to work on some of the trade differences. India has a very large trade deficit with China. China has given some additional market access for certain agricultural products to India. But you haven't seen, again, fundamental issues on that side get resolved, including increased market access for Indian companies across the board, or areas where Indian companies have comparative advantage getting more benefits from China. So you see some kind of resolution of that, but the broader competitive dynamics in the relationship very much remains. So you've seen stabilization, but not resolution. But there's always the potential for and not just the boundary issue. You could see, for example, a maritime issue flaring up. You could even see, for example, India objecting to certain Chinese moves, either it's in neighborhood or with regard to the river flow issue that they have with the Brahmaputra.
I think the more important area of contest going forward are two. The first area of conflict is going to be around technology. And I think their decision time, India, is approaching quite fast. I think in the next 2 to 3 years, India's casual, ambiguous decision-making processes vis-a-vis choice of Chinese hardware, Chinese 5G networks, Chinese technologies, Chinese investments will need to either be institutionalized through some strategic process or will have to be rejected through some consensus. I think we cannot be casual in our decision-making processes vis-a-vis technology with China because unfortunately from Cold War, we are now going to be in an age of code wars. And the Chinese are really coding the future of the world. Do we want to be part of their algorithm or do we believe there is another algorithm that suits our future more? As we enter the fourth industrial revolution, India will have to decide where it wants to be and India will have to thereafter build alliances, partnerships, collaborations and networks that can create a viable alternative to the digital future that China wants to offer to the world. So that's one part, which is something that we should watch out for. The second area we should watch out for is what happens in the post-COVID world vis-a-vis the America-China relationship. And how long can we balance both of them? I think since time immemorial, we have managed these two relationships. Will we have that room to maneuver in the days ahead? Will we have to make a choice? And what will that choice be? If the Americans decide that decoupling is the future, tech decoupling, trade decoupling, strategic decoupling, and forcing countries to choose, take sides. I think that is another area where a possible India-China contest, conflict, even a heated exchange could arise from.
Just a parochial issue, because from the Chinese perspective, the boundary issue is there, but a more linked sensitive issue, it was linked at the beginning at least, is Tibet. And for the Chinese, the presence of the Dalai Lama and a number of Tibetans in India, which they have always seen as a sore subject and a source of concern, and why they think that they say that they distrust Indian intentions. They believed when the Dalai Lama escaped to India that the US and India essentially planned that escape, and it was a very anti-China move. The reason I mention it is there will be a point in the next few years, hopefully not too soon, but at some point there will be the question of the succession of the Dalai Lama. And this issue could come to a head because the Chinese have said that China gets to decide that whoever the Dalai Lama is will need Beijing's concurrence. That is not the view that India has, that the Dalai Lama has obviously said himself. He said there might not even be another Dalai Lama. But this is going to be an issue that not just will come up for the India-China context, but this is, I think, where you will see China use its influence to get a number of whether it's Belt and Road countries or other allies and partners, to take a stand which backs them. And you will see India working on its like-minded partners to ensure some sort of, now it doesn't have to be diametrically opposed views. India does not tend to speak publicly about this issue, but this will come up at some point and be an issue that is worth watching. Just briefly on the broader point that Samir brought on the US-China competition, if it intensifies, or even if it doesn't, but these technology issues are, whether the US is saying so or because China itself has decided to decouple, that this issue is going to come up about choice. And I think people often, and this is where the Cold War analogy does not work, because for India, the previous Cold War, the US-Soviet competition, was actually easy to not make choices. These were two countries that India partnered with, both used kind of played one off against each other. In a US-China competition, the same instincts will not apply because India has a direct dispute with one of the major powers competing. And so India's choices will have to reflect that. And there will be some choices that India, and Samir pointed out the big one, technology, that India will have to make certain choices. You cannot actually essentially split it down the middle unless India has the capability to develop its own capacities, which in some areas it does, but in some areas it will not make sense, even for kind of interoperability reasons. So I think there will be some choices that will have to be made. And I think it will be an easier sell even for the domestic audience because of the reasons that Samir said.
I do want to sort of shift the conversation to the other side and take at least a brief moment to talk about also areas of shared interest and potential for collaboration, because they do exist. It's worth pointing out that the countries have a relationship. They do trade with each other actually at a fairly high volume. As you've pointed out, there is a little bit of an imbalance. There's a huge trade deficit on the Indian side, which is an area of concern. But still, maybe going back to you, Samir, if you talk to policymakers in Delhi, maybe if you talk to policymakers in Beijing, where would be a good place to start intensifying dialogue and collaboration? What are actually areas where the two countries are aligned and would see eye to eye and could, if coming together, could make some headway?
Contrary to some perceptions about my own recent writings, I have been a big supporter of a deeper, stronger India-China engagement. I am a supporter not because I'm a blind romantic. I am a supporter because I am a realist. And for me, it is unlikely that India is going to become a $10 trillion economy in the next 15 years, unless the India-China economic transfer or economic size moves from $150 billion to close to $700 to $800 billion. Very something similar to what the Chinese and Americans share today. So India-China economic engagement is one of the important drivers of India's growth in the future. I think that is something that most will agree with, that we are never going to reach our full economic potential unless we have strong economic relationships with the three big trading blocs, such as the EU, the US, and China, and a couple of other mid-sized blocs, Japanese, the ASEAN. If the African countries as a whole are taken together, they constitute the sixth. So these six trading relationships are extremely important. The two most important ones will be, of course, EU and China. That's one area that needs attention because currently, as Tanvi mentioned, it's a perverse trading relationship. We have a huge deficit and we are in many ways supplying them raw materials and buying it back at great premium. The perverse nature of trade needs to change. Some of it can be balanced through large Chinese investments. They are not yet happening. Smaller ones are coming into the technology platforms and the startup sectors. But big ticket Chinese investments are still elusive. We still have our traditional partners putting in more investments into India than China does. That may change in the future. And again, that's a conversation we should be thinking about. Now, that is offset by deep concerns because Chinese interests are in sectors where you have huge national security considerations. So it is unlikely that India is going to allow big China tech to dominate our technology sector or big Chinese infrastructure companies to develop our airports, ports, and maritime lanes. So I think, again, we are constricted by our politics and our economic growth and our economic progress is hitting a political wall in some sense. So our economics can go so far and no further. So that's one area of cooperation. There is enough wiggle room to grow it more. Let's find those safe spaces and perhaps at least reach 2/3 or 3/4 of the way in terms of what could be our maximum potential. The second area, of course, used to be global governance. We were more often than not in the same corner when it came to trade negotiations, food negotiations, drugs and pharmacy conversations, and plethora, ITU and all other international institutions. Now with China's increasing domination and perverse manipulation of many of the UN institutions and the Bretton Woods institutions eventually, you will find India less willing to be on the Chinese corner, even in these international institutions. I think the Corona episode is going to deeply impact India's ability to back China in many of these international conversations. And you are going to see India increasingly leave the corner where China stands on many of these global matters. This is going to be a negative, a downside to the relationship. This was one of the strengths. We could build the BRICS together. We could create the Asian Infrastructure Bank together. We could be in the SCO together. I think this is it. Increasingly, India is going to be suspicious of institutions that China dominates, controls, or has the capacity to manipulate. You might, in fact, see the Indians willing to cooperate with other countries, including the developed world, which they have not done till now, to install winning candidates which are non-Chinese in many of these institutions. So that's the second area, which was traditionally a strong area, may be altered in the coming days. And the third and final area, of course, is in terms of the planet. I think that still remains the most important and most viable area of cooperation, which is the green sectors, collaboration on solar, collaboration on building green projects around the world, collaboration on building sustainable blue economy, sustainable food supply chains. I think in the SDG and green space, you still have enough segments where there is a possibility of partnership because China has built certain capabilities there. China and India have collaborated in financial institutions that can underwrite it. And India is going to be the single biggest market for many of these products in the next 10 years. So I think that's the positive area where we can work in the SDG and the finance sectors.
I think it is worth kind of stepping back and look at what is the motivation for engagement. I think Samir pointed to the economic relationship both sides tried to see ways that it could benefit, and it has grown over the last kind of 20, 25 years. But I think there's a broader strategic thinking behind why the two countries, neither has an incentive, neither wants to get into, for this to go from, say, a hot piece, actually being heated. For India to actually treat China like not just a strategic competitor, but a existential challenge, which it's not, but as a more serious competitor, India would have to kind of devote resources to defense spending that it will not be able to do. It will require choices and taking away from development priorities that are just not feasible. I think the other thing is there has been in Delhi this view that it helps kind of keep the peace to have that kind of level of engagement. It incentivizes China to not do certain things. That is always up for debate, whether is it actually kind of stabilizing the relationship or is it just one more area of friction. For India, the other reason for engagement is that China can actually do Indian interests a fair bit of harm, whether that's bilaterally, regionally, or even in international institutions. It is to this day blocking Indian membership in the nuclear suppliers group, for example. If the UN Security Council is ever reformed, it's the only country that has not endorsed permanent membership for India. And you've seen this in many different ways. The idea is a kind of steady relationship, an engaged relationship with the country that is its largest neighbor makes sense because it will both perhaps help Chinese to temper Chinese behavior towards India, but also perhaps incentivize China to actually do things that might be helpful to India. For example, restrain Pakistan at times during crises.
Remember, the conversation with Tanvi and Samir was recorded in April 2020. And the relationship between China and India has taken a definite turn for the worse since then, with the Galwan incident and the subsequent Indian ban on Chinese apps. But there has also been another notable development since then, the Quad. That's short for Quadrilateral Dialogue, a loose group consisting of the US, Australia, Japan, and India that has been around for almost a decade, but which only now seems to gain momentum, with a first meeting at the heads of state level in spring 2021. There is a lot of conversation on whether the Quad is supposed to be a hedge against China. The Quad itself often uses the term free and open Indo-Pacific. In November 2020, I asked Shashi Tharoor, the member of the Indian Parliament whom you've heard earlier, how he would define the term Indo-Pacific.
Rather than what I understand, I think we should be very clear what those who are proposing this idea mean. It really is an American reformulation of the earlier concept of the Asia-Pacific region. But it boils down very much to an increased focus on the Indian Ocean and its collateral seas at both ends. So it's essentially what the West would consider the Middle East, all the way up to the East China Sea and beyond to the west coast of America. And that's the Indo-Pacific, two big oceans, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, assorted seas and straits and so on in between, and a fairly significant population and landmass as well. So in that region, obviously, the four countries of the Quadrilateral Dialogue are countries that are assumed to be united by a certain hesitation about the increasing dominance of this region by China. Now, there was at one time a sort of reflection of what's called a containment strategy, as the US appeared to be interested in getting partners or allies to join it in containment operations against China. It found very few takers. Neither India nor Australia, nor to some degree Japan even, were particularly keen on a containment strategy. But I think the possibility of a constraining approach, that is, engage with China, trade with China, be friendly with China, but limit how much damage it can do to the vital interests of others by leveraging the cooperation of these countries to constrain China's freedom to do certain things. That seems to be the way we are going. But as far as the Quadrilateral Dialogue is concerned, it's very, very incipient. It so happens that the four countries of the Quadrilateral Alliance recently participated in a naval exercise, a joint naval exercise off the shores of India, which has suddenly led some people to ask, is there a military or security dimension in the Indo-Pacific issue for the Quadrilateral Dialogue? Is it now a Quadrilateral Alliance? I think the members of it don't consider themselves yet to be an alliance, and certainly not a military alliance. But clearly we're watching at an early stage something that is in the process of evolving and whose evolution could well conceivably result in much more intense relationships amongst these four countries than we have ever seen in the past.
And that's it for today. If you're interested in learning more about India-China relations, all of our guests have written excellent books on the subject, and we will link to these in today's show notes. You can also go back and watch the full recordings of my conversations with Tanvi and Samir, as well as with Shashi. And here's my recommendation for today: Chinese Cooking Demystified. It's one of my favorite YouTube channels out there. It features well-made cooking videos for a huge variety of Chinese dishes. I have to admit, I have not actually made anything from the channel yet myself. But if you like food, and Chinese food in particular, it's very enjoyable and insightful to watch. Thank you very much for listening today. In our next episode, we'll move on to Russia, China's big neighbor to the north. This episode of China and the World was produced by Serena Young and edited by Denise Schaubli. My name is Nico Luchsinger. See you soon.
Follow Asia Society Switzerland on social media and visit our website for more information on upcoming events.